this program today is in recognition of the UN Security Council's Resolution 1325, which is coming up on a 20th anniversary. And we seek today to increase awareness of this resolution and of what has become known as the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. Now, in the past few months as we've been planning this, I've lost count of the number of times that when I mention this, WPS, that's a vocabulary we're going to be using today, I've been met with jokes, eye rolls, thinking, oh, this just means more women in government, right? Or, oh, does this mean that you're going to have women register for the draft? I've gone so far as to joke that I need a t-shirt that says, WPS is a thing. But this is a really important learning experience, though, for those of us who end up steeped in this issue, in that, again, awareness. Awareness is key, because before anything can be adopted, we even need to know the word, and before we know the word, we need to understand what goes into it. And it's been a great reminder to those of us in the national security space that in general, national security has a lot of meanings and about as many definitions and meanings as there are people defining it. But for a lot of folks, especially in the United States, when they think national security, they think of the military, they think of hard security aspects of U.S. defense policy, including use of force. They're unlikely to include, for many, they're unlikely to think of women as being part of that national security picture, even though women have fought for this country going back to before it was a country. Many do not realize that women are on the front lines of peace building and peacekeeping, not only in the United States, but also abroad. And while women are particularly vulnerable in periods of violent conflict and humanitarian crises, experience shows us that there is a correlation between women's involvement in peace processes and stability building activities and the likelihood that resulting peace will be maintained in a long-term fashion. Yet, nevertheless, people continue to question how women, peace, and security, WPS, fits into this hard national security paradigm that so many of us apply. And I want to challenge that very approach. I want to challenge it as being particularly U.S. focused and coming from a Western cultural bent. And I hope that our discussions today, while our first panel will address U.S. issues, our second panel is going to talk about these from more of an international perspective. And while our military and hard security endeavors might be most visual to us when we think of expressions of our national military might, as I said, decades of experience show us that preventing and resolving conflict and maintaining peace, they do require strategies on and resources aimed at development and diplomacy in addition to traditional defense. So some of us refer to this as the 3 Ds of national security: defense, diplomacy, and development. And I think that the WPS agenda really brings those 3 together. And right now, some of you may have heard this in the news this week, there's talk about foreign aid budgets, for example, in the United States. And during a previous time when budgets were being talked about in Congress, General Mattis, who was then general, as opposed to Secretary of Defense, but he said in 2013 in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. And I think that very succinctly points to what we're going to be speaking about so much today. Women play a really important role in the development and diplomacy strategies in addition to our hard defense strategies. As I said, these 3 things go together. Research has shown that, for example, investing in women reduces poverty, increases local economic activity, and improves child health in communities, both the immediate community but also the wider economies of countries. Gender equity is recognized as an indicator of nations' peacefulness. Gender inequality in a society can be an indicator of potential conflict. So, back to this WPS agenda. National security issues affect men, women, and children differently, and the failure to consider the differing effects can lead to flawed security policies. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict, particularly now as the rise of irregular warfare and gray zone conflicts pull civilian populations into the fog of war. Violence that can also be used to maintain male-dominated social structures. And instability and conflict are threat multipliers, exacerbating existing gender inequities that already make women and girls particularly vulnerable in inequitable societies. Even if women are not on the front lines of conflict, they are on the front lines of its aftermath, picking up the pieces of the broken streets, broken communities, and broken families left behind. And when the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1325 in 2000, it recognized the special role that women play in the prevention and resolution of conflict, in maintaining the peace, and the particular vulnerabilities that they have in times of conflict. But one of the things that makes 1325 groundbreaking is that it recognizes that women are not only victims. Rather than relegate them to those that are effective, or that victim label, it seeks to change the vocabulary of conflict prevention and resolution and empower women as participants in global world order. Again, in peacekeeping, conflict prevention, and peace stabilization. And to that end, there are 4 pillars that support the mandates of this initial resolution and its progeny. The first is participation, which means increasing women's participation at all levels of decision-making in domestic and international institutions and conflict resolution efforts. We have protection, which is protecting individuals from sexual and gender-based violence and the effects of conflict. Prevention, promoting and strengthening women's legal rights, increasing accountability for perpetrators of sexual violence, and supporting law enforcement efforts to prevent sexual violence, including through domestic and international prosecutions. And finally, relief and recovery, advancing the ability of decision and policymakers to address crisis relief and recovery measures through a gendered lens. And in the years since 1325's passage, as I said, we're coming up on this 20th anniversary, the Security Council has passed 10 subsequent resolutions which all build on these pillars, support these pillars, and build on the previous resolutions. And they have pointed to particular issues within this agenda, including putting the onus on member states and regional organizations to remove barriers to women's participation, promoting relevant data collection and data sharing efforts on WPS, implementing best practices, drawing attention to particular areas of conflict and particular areas within this WPS agenda, which is formed from these resolutions, drawing attention to particular areas of need on these issues, including, but not limited to, the use of sexual violence against women, children, and men in areas of destabilization and conflict. So this agenda, as taken together with the resolutions, has been monumental for advancing gender equality efforts worldwide and elevated the conversations about women's engagement in security roles as decision makers empowered to take action and advance peace. And these resolutions are backstopped by international law frameworks, including the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We're going to hear us maybe today mention CEDAW. That's what we're referring to. Also, there's the Rome Statute for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. You might hear us say the Rome Statute or the ICC statute, so I wanted to mention that vocabulary as well. And as I said, we're going to address both U.S. perspectives and international perspectives today. So the implementation of 1325 in the United States faced a great deal of hurdles at its inception. And there was a lot of concern, for example, expressed by those in Congress that implementation was going to somehow allow the United Nations to infringe on U.S. sovereignty. So after facing these challenges, President Obama, and we are going to talk a bit about this today on our panel, issued an executive order which facilitated WPS programming in the U.S. and the development of what's called a National Action Plan on WPS in the U.S. And NAPS, this is another vocabulary word we'll use today, which, while I don't like it, acronyms. So NAPS. The U.S. Initial NAP was in 2011, and we have a subsequent one in 2016. But I want to mention and I want to underscore that WPS is a bipartisan issue. And the WPS Act of 2017 was signed by President Trump. And so this is sought to codify some of these WPS action items, because as an executive order coming from President Obama, this could be changed by a subsequent president. Well, now we have Congress saying, no, this is here, it's here to stay, and now I'm directing you, executive agencies, to take action on it. And this is the perspective in the US. We're going to tease out pros, cons, challenges that have come from that today. But as I mentioned before, this is not just a US issue, this is an international issue. And so our second panel today, which will be moderated by Dean Dr. Rangada da Silva de Alves, will address international efforts to further the resolution, reflecting on the core recommendations of a 2015 study by the United Nations that looked at what had been done in the first 15 years of WPS, best practices, et cetera. But she is going to discuss with her panelists, who are all recognized experts on WPS implementation, some perspectives from the ground. What does this mean in real life, in tangible terms, to real people in countries around the world? And one of those examples in particular is going to be about South Sudan, which has had to face these challenges head on. And I say personally, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion from our panelists on that. And then we're going to conclude today with a discussion between Professor Claire Finkelstein and Michelle Flournoy about her experiences as a female leader within the national security community here in the United States. She is the former Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Defense. And during her time in that position, the United States was debating the formulation of the U.S. Action Plan and how to further integrate women into civilian and military national security operations. So that will be an interesting discussion as well. I encourage you to stay for that. So I would like to end with, given that we are in Philly, a quote from Abigail Adams that was made in a letter to her husband, where she cautioned to him to remember the ladies as we formed our country and made our policies here. And I believe the full quote is, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." And I would like to hope that the WPS agenda is helping all of us do that a little better. And so with that, I'm going to turn to introducing our panelists today. And I promise that I will keep this short, given that I do want time for our discussions.